Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. Since I started covering the channel Hakeem, I've been given a ton of recommendations to check out today's channel and the channel's second thought. And this video is called, We Need to Talk About Authoritarianism. So I asked a lot of people that were recommending Second Thought to me where would be a good place to start, or at least what would be a really good video to kind of get my feet wet here. And a bunch of them recommended this one. Our original video is going to be linked down below. Please support that. And thank you for liking this video and subbing to the channel. All right, let's get started. All right, hopefully you guys have liked when I check out some of these videos that, again, kind of use kind of the framework of different political ideologies to kind of analyze history. I've done it from what you would consider left-wing sources, right-wing sources. So, I mean, again, I've looked at a bunch of PragerU videos, you know, and then on the other spectrum, I've covered Hakeem. And it looks like this one, I believe, is more on that side, more like Hakeem as well. I don't know a lot, so let me know about this person or group, kind of what's kind of their history is and kind of what we know. That would be great. And if you want me to cover more from this channel, let me know down below. And again, the best place to go is over to my Discord server where you can drop video suggestions. And when I see those, especially videos that I've seen proposed, you know, a bunch of times, I'll definitely be more likely to check it out and record some commentary on it. So, all right. So this one just says we need to talk about authoritarianism. All right. Maybe an overused term.
Authoritarianism, the practice of eating only people who have published books.
What?
Wait.
That's the only...
that's not right.
That's the only definition?
Authoritarianism. Truly
who's this?
One
Is
of
he the guy?
words of all time. A decadent 7 syllables long and wonderfully vague.
What's his name?
If you've ever had a conversation about politics, and if you're watching this channel, I'm sure you have, you've likely heard someone use the term, or maybe you've even used it yourself.
He's authoritarian.
It's popular in pretty much every corner of the mainstream political spectrum.
I'll be honest though, I hear other terms that people use a wide interpretations of definitions on, probably more than authoritarianism. Like that person's a fascist, that person's a communist, that person's a socialist. I guess authoritarian you could put it that tier, but I don't know. I don't know if I hear it as much as those three I just said, but regardless.
Liberals, conservatives, the dreaded centrists.
Liberals,
and
another
even
term.
some lefty groups like anarchists
and conservative gets messed up.
But what does it mean?
Chomsky.
And what gives it so much weight in the political discourse? Well, that's
so
what this
automatically
video is
means
about.
bad.
We've got a pretty poor understanding of what authority is here in the West, but I bet we can fix that.
Okay.
Let's start with the generally accepted definition. Authoritarianism, favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of the government, at the expense of personal freedom. Okay, this is a pretty bad definition if we're being honest. It mentions the government in there, but doesn't really commit to being political, just kinda, when you want people to follow the rules. That's not super helpful when we're trying to nail down a heavily used term, and one that deals with some serious topics.
True.
Okay, so what if we expand it to include how people generally use the term?
By the way, this is probably where if you do have the guts, I guess, to actually engage somebody on like political discussion, that you define your terms. So like if you hear them use a word and you also may use that word, it's like, hey, let's talk about what we mean first before we actually do it. You can end up saving a lot of time and a lot of frustration if you do that. Again, they may be wrong on it, but then you might get into then you can avoid the like just debating what the definitions mean. But who cares what the word means if you're just in that conversation 1v1 saying this is what I at least mean or I understand it to mean, and then you can move on with your conversation. Otherwise, have you ever been in that cycle where all you do is just debate the term but not the concepts? That's so like counterproductive.
Generally speaking, when someone uses the word authoritarian, they are often, but not always, using it as a term to demonize a system that is different from their own, regardless of the facts.
Sure.
They're using it as a synonym for totalitarian.
Usually, yeah.
A word you don't really hear much anymore. It's sort of fallen by the wayside. And
see, that's a term that should probably be used more because you can use it to discuss right-wing, left-wing, extreme centrists. Yes, that's a thing. That's a thing that we can use a lot more. And you can actually find more common ground among things that come from different ideologies because you're kind of talking about another axis of not just left and right, but also like, you know, a north and south. So a little more authoritarian versus more like libertarian, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Tarian. Kind of like using the word commie as a slur has been superseded by tanky in the last few years.
I have just been learning about this. So I've been getting emails and stuff from people, especially when I cover some of these channels, and people are like, just so you know, that person that you've been covering is a tanky. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And then you have to get in another discussion. But from what I understand, I don't know much more than, okay, it's like a Is it just like a really loud communist? Is that what that's supposed to be? Like, especially annoying way? Is that what a tankie's supposed to be? Is this guy a tankie in your eyes? I don't know.
Yeah, different era. Both of these words, authoritarian and totalitarian, have been leveled at fascism and communism, often in a direct attempt to conflate the two.
Sure.
This is largely due to the US's extreme anti-communism post-World War II, to the point that they'd lump in their former friends, the people without whom the Allies could not have won the war, with what most people believe to be the greatest evil in history. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's all well and good. People use a political term vaguely to demonize their opponents.
Sure.
Big surprise.
For sure.
But we still need some specifics. What exactly makes a state authoritarian?
So is this just going to be a discussion of just a definition and saying we need to use this one definition? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, if you have a scroll through the comments of just about any political video that talks about socialism, you'll find people ready with their pre-written list of objections, usually bundled under the prime objection, that's authoritarian. Things on that list include the existence of large prisons or labor camps, a covert police force, state media, a strongman leader, censorship, that sort of thing. And to be fair, all those things do sound scary, and none of them are ideal. I think we can all agree that we'd love to live in a society where prisons didn't need to exist. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay. I mean, I mean, there's plenty of terms like this where just they have a connotation instantly of being bad, and you don't have to even explain it, but it just, you know, because so many people just interpret things based off of the vibes, right? And what they perceive is context, not by actual definitions. I mean, we don't have to literally learn the definition of every word in a language. We get so much of its meaning just by, again, its usage and its context.
Before we go any further, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to attack anyone here. The objection to authoritarianism is present in a lot of different camps. People may define it a little differently. For example, a libertarian might call seatbelt laws authoritarian, while a liberal might consider the influence of the church on the government authoritarian. Meanwhile, my anarchist friends are yelling from the back of the room that the very existence of a state is authoritarian and we need to abolish bedtime.
The anarchist folks.
Again, teasing, no offense intended. Okay,
bedtime.
We all on the same page? Authoritarianism is a red flag.
That means little kids are anarchists. If any of you have small kids, are like, I want to go to bed, you'd be like, you are an anarchist. And they'd probably be like, what's that? And then you're like, shut up, go to bed.
For a lot of people, and there are some specific objections we can consider. So let's consider them.
I just hope this is a useful
Here's what we're going to do
discussion
for the rest of the video. First, we'll look at the list of objections as understood by liberals.
Okay.
And I mean that in the broadest sense. Liberals as in subjects of liberal states, not in the conservative versus liberal sense.
All right.
Then we'll look at those same objections as understood by the left.
By the way, I like that he was defining what he meant by his usage of liberal. That's really useful.
Again, pretty broadly speaking. Basically everyone from social democrats and beyond.
Okay.
Then finally, we'll consider a better way to understand authority and authoritarianism. Sound good?
Okay. So it is coming from a more leftist perspective. This is like the Johnny Harris stuff where we do like film setting up the set.
Friends. I've got a pretty good idea of the kinds of places you feel are authoritarian.
More comfy now, though.
Top of the list, Soviet Union, the big one.
Sure.
Perhaps the target of the most intense smear campaign in history. Then we've got Cuba, China, North Korea, and likely a handful of other projects.
Definitely going to vary. Definitely going to vary within the context of each one of these authoritarians, right?
These are the big ones.
Or should.
When you look at any of these projects, it's not difficult to see the one thing they all have in common. They're all socialist. And when you see this, it's not entirely unreasonable to come to the conclusion that authoritarianism is a core feature of socialism.
If you're new to my channel, I say a lot of things that are coming through my head. I'm not necessarily saying that's what he's saying, or even like he's not going to clear it later. I just tell you what you go through my head. Hope he doesn't think that like those are the only people that people might consider authoritarians. What about the no Germans? And by the way, if you're new, I have to say stuff like that because YouTube doesn't like the use of certain groups of people. You know what I mean, Mustache Man?
We'll address this a bit more thoroughly in a few minutes.
Spaghetti Man.
But suffice it to say that in the West, we may have a slightly biased opinion on the matter, through no fault of our own. We've just been subjected to nearly 100 years of Red Scare propaganda at this point.
True.
Everything we're taught growing up in the imperial core, especially in the US, points us towards the conclusion that communism is evil and capitalism is righteous. But here's the part where I'm going to have to ask you to be willing to consider some unpleasant truths.
Okay.
And I don't say these things to engage in whataboutism or because I'm anti-American or something. Quite the contrary.
There's a lot of qualifications
I believe
on
that
that.
in order for any country to live up to the standards it sets for others, it needs to soberly reflect on the facts.
Okay.
And the facts indicate that everything we're taught about these awful authoritarian socialist countries, we are also guilty of, and often to a far greater degree. Let me elaborate.
This will be interesting then. So is it going to be, so is this video going to be more about like the irony of that, of the West calling others authoritarian when we ourselves may have those tendencies? It'll be good because he said, you know, often it's the case where it can be more. It'll be interesting to see, like, when you stack it up, I guess, if we're going to be fair, if there's going to be fair analysis, stacking it up and which one's been more authoritarian or maybe has more instances of authoritarianism.
One thing that rarely gets the attention it deserves is how we talk about authoritarianism. And I mean that literally, like the very words we use. Take the DPRK.
Like authority?
We never hear about the government of North Korea. We hear about the Kim regime. This is common when Westerners talk about non-capitalist governments, or even
people may not say the Kim regime, but they definitely will just say, they usually mean, yeah, Kim's, right?
Ones that aren't vassal states of the US.
But yeah.
They have a regime,
or just communist
we and
Korea.
Our allies have a government. The way we talk about different systems goes a long way towards coloring our perception of them.
One way you're going to see regime, though, is the lack of diversity in those government politics. What I mean by that is, you know, there is pretty much no diversity of political parties with differing political values. That's probably why somebody would say regime more than government.
People criticize labor camps or secret police or any number of other scary authoritarian words. But here's the thing. We have those too. And if you look at the data,
the US
often to a far greater extent than any socialist project in history. We just don't call them by those names. We don't have secret police, we have plainclothes officers or the intelligence community. We don't have gulags, we have detention centers. Which,
it depends on it. Gulags, were work camps. Not all detention centers are work camps. Gulags was slave labor. Now, there's definitely an argument you could say that for-profit prison systems, where some of them will be actually doing labor, could be seen as like a version of that, but there's definitely a difference between a gulag and a detention center.
By the way, house far more inmates than the Soviet Union ever did. And of course, we don't have slave labor, we have penal labor. We put inmates to work manufacturing hand sanitizer during a pandemic.
Well,
we have
yeah.
penal.
Remember, just slavery has such a diversity of types of slavery. There are people that are, you know, historically were basically used as slaves because of things like debt or criminal activity of some kind. But then, of course, there's the chattel slavery, which is seeing those people as property that can literally be bought and sold like commodities. Penal labor can have, that, but there's not really like transferable and personal ownership. More of, the prison, I guess, owns them. And I guess the state owns them. So there might be some similarities with there, but I'm thinking like the transference and sale of them.
Labor. We put inmates to work manufacturing hand sanitizer during a pandemic or fighting fires because enshrined in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime.
There's an argument for that. There definitely is an argument for that because when I talk about the Roman Empire or like Greece, which is what it's been common, right, or what's going on right now in my classes, those were societies that huge amounts of their percentage of their entire population as slaves. You'd be talking, like a third of that. But it's not always chattel slavery, but it is, some kind of forced work. It could be, again, criminals, debtors. There's a very wide definition of that.
A lot of the time, that crime is just being poor. A parking ticket you couldn't pay. Getting caught with the same drug a rich person uses, but you don't have the money to buy yourself out of trouble.
True.
We don't have a Ministry of
It's
War.
definitely
We have a Department of Defense. Despite never once fighting a defensive Ministry of War, we don't have the money to buy yourself out of trouble. We don't have a Ministry of War, we have a Department of Defense.
Well, Ministry of War seems a lot more offensive. Like the goal of your military is to be offensive. Now, it doesn't mean the Department of Defense doesn't do offensive things. We have a lot of that in the United States and had that in history.
Despite never once fighting a defensive war.
By the way, I guess I wouldn't fall for this video, but another term that gets thrown around a lot right now, which again means very different things depending on who you are in the situation and where your allegiances are, is the word terrorism and terrorists. That is, again, one of those words that instantly gives you these certain feelings and vibes, right? But you have one person's terrorism, another one is another one's resistance force. You know what I mean? So you see that's a term. But I don't know if that would fit in here, but that's a big one right now that we got to talk about.
Military action taken by the United States, from bombing hospitals to drone striking foreign citizens, is given the cover of defense.
Sure.
We don't have state media or propaganda, we just have news.
Well, difference is supposed to be like actual state ownership of media, because that has happened in regimes, okay, both left and right.
Those news outlets are, of course, all owned by the same corporate interest who funnel millions of dollars a year into government pockets to make sure their profits are secure.
That is fair.
Their anchors dutifully repeat the ruling class's ideological positions.
So maybe it's just, maybe the difference is just directly owned or directly operated by the state, or maybe operating on behalf of the state. Like you might say corporations, it might be seen as more indirect there. There's some fairness to that.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely
Anyone else getting sick of people you saying that all the time?
Extremely dangerous to our democracy.
We say it so
Their
much.
guys are dictators, ours are presidents. Their state has a regime, ours...
That's true.
Their guys.
This is true, because in those countries, it's not like that's the title you are. Unless you're like ancient Rome, where dictator also meant something very different. It could be somebody that has full state power, even if it's under a certain amount of time. You know, maybe like a Julius Caesar, but we know how that ended. And because of the way it ended, it gets that connotation. But yeah, dictator is less of a title and more of a ruling style, I guess you would say. But yeah, you could say there are plenty of presidents that have ruled dictatorially.
Guys are dictators, ours are presidents. Their state has a regime, ours has a government.
We heard that,
We're
yep.
free and happy, they're oppressed and miserable. Our nuclear arsenal is
Projection.
for deterrence. Theirs is a threat to global peace,
Yeah.
despite the US being the only country on Earth to have ever used nuclear weapons. And we did it twice, on civilians, on purpose. We have a democracy, they
Sure.
have a...
Long debate goes along that, right? About usage of those as a deterrent. That is an interesting one. Yeah, deterrence to war. Dictatorship, democracy, sure.
dictatorship.
I mean, can you vote dictators in? That happens. You can vote dictators in.
Despite, by all accounts, places like Cuba and China having far more representation and opportunity for democratic involvement than places like the US. So the way we talk about
Fair.
government structures, characteristics, and actions matters. Without even knowing it, we can end up falling prey to some very subtle, very sophisticated propaganda that primes us to hate people we've never met, whose economic and government structures we know nothing about.
True.
And with whom we share far more in common than we do with
Yes,
our own leaders.
You're right.
Okay, fine, but those are just words.
It is the othering of people and seeing them as abstract concepts. It reminds me of All Quiet on the Western Front, if you read the book, where Paul is in the foxhole with the dying French soldier. And he's dying, but he doesn't really have the guts to put him out of his misery. And then eventually, you know, the French soldier does die. And he goes through his wallet and sees like a picture of him, like with his family and all this. And it was supposed to be this like light bulb goes off where he's like, I never thought of you or these enemies that I'm fighting as actual people. You are abstractions, I believe was the translation of it. You weren't personalized, you know, until you become face to face and are able to in some way become sympathetic to their backgrounds. And you end up finding more and more. And then Paul, you know, he says like, you know, in another life, we could have been like neighbors, we could have been friends, but says how much I guess he hates those that made this division be put upon him.
Who cares what we call our stuff, all right? Let's talk specifics.
Okay, great.
In a striking 2012 article by Adam Gopnik called The Caging of America, the author notes that, quote, overall, there are now more people under correctional supervision in America, more than 6 million, than were in the Gulag under Stalin at its height. And this is coming from an American writer with a thoroughly liberal worldview.
When was the height of that? Is it after the war, after 20 million people died? Or before that, during, I guess, the Purge? I'm kind of thinking maybe, is it be during the 30s? I mean, it can have a higher time after so many people died in World War II. But yes, do you think that's like an apples to apples comparison? Let's hear what he's got.
It's a poignant comparison because, as we all know, Stalin, gulags, and the Soviet Union are the trifecta of what the average person sees as authoritarianism. The fact that we're doing worse than that, even if you buy the inflated numbers of widely debunked books like the Black Book of Communism, should tell you something. And fun fact, the CIA wrote a report in the 50s that the whole Stalin strongman thing was largely a myth. It was just a very useful myth to the capitalist powers, so why not perpetuate it?
So he's saying it's not quite, he wasn't quite the strong man that is discussed. That'd be interesting to see a little bit more about that and see like the challenges to power and things like that. What effect did the purges actually have when, again, eliminates half of the military leadership there, a lot of political opponents, a lot of people that were, Bolsheviks and like him in the whole, going through the revolution and then the Civil War and everything. So, but again, I have to bring up, I don't want to go into too much detail, especially when you look at how prisons operate very differently, again, in the United States versus, say, the gulags.
Know what you're thinking. Everybody knows the US has a thing for prisons. That's like one thing we could ease back on a little bit. That doesn't make the country authoritarian. Let's continue then. How about surveillance?
True.
It's pretty widely believed that citizens of socialist states are the subject of extreme surveillance. But what if I told you that
I also think he is pitting it towards authoritarianism, or sorry, like socialist states. And I guess that is kind of his motive there, but there are plenty of fascistic states and stuff like that. And if he wants to, I guess, bracket or frame the United States along that same vein of, say, Spaghetti Man and Spaghetti Country and the No Germans, then so be it.
None of them hold a candle to the US. Don't believe me? Take a look at Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Thanks to this piece of legislation, every single person in the United States is the subject of incredibly intense scrutiny. We have a mass surveillance program that allows for the collection of phone conversations, text messages, emails, web searches, and social media messages.
Oh, for sure.
Everything you do is being monitored.
For sure.
But
and again, interestingly, we opt into a lot of that, right? Think how much information people give out about themselves, about their locations, their beliefs, their work, all those things voluntarily because of our obsession with, say, social media. How much you post about yourself, Instagram and Facebook and those sort of things. Now, of course, it's going to amp up big time, especially with the Patriot Act. That was really a door that we went through that we probably will never go back through once again.
It's called the Foreign Surveillance Act, so why are we in the crosshairs? Well, it started out as a way to keep tabs on communications between US citizens and foreign nationals due to threat of some kind. But over the last decade or so, the scope of the project has expanded dramatically. What was once strictly a counterterrorism tool, which is already incredibly vague and dangerous, has now morphed into a domestic surveillance apparatus where the NSA provides this data to the CIA and the FBI, which they can use to open investigations into any person in the country without a warrant. But what if we want to give US intelligence agencies the benefit of the doubt? They're just doing their job, right? If you're not a criminal, you have nothing to hide.
That's the big thing you hear. It's like, when that did come up. I remember when like Patriot Act was passed, right after 9/11. That was the big counter to it when you heard people talk about that, because people, again, were so motivated and emotionally charged from that event that the idea of giving up some civil liberties potentially is okay when it comes to what the potential is of the enemies of the United States, right? Say potential future terrorist attacks. Obviously, as we've gotten further away from those events and the emotionally charged nature of it has gone further away, people are more and more now to say that there is this authoritarian type of surveillance that's going on. People dislike it as you go on again. But historically saying, if we were to have something like this again, like a 9/11 per se, that you would see us probably react similarly. Okay. That's just, it's how history's been. You see all kinds of people and go back to philosophies that come out of like the Enlightenment. Look at like a Voltaire or something like this, where like a John Locke, where you can go back and see those same arguments happening all through time. But again, the biggest argument is, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to fear.
To a 2022 report, the FBI and CIA conduct millions of these backdoor searches for no legitimate reason. They've pulled data on family members, journalists, political commentators, even government officials. For what reason? Who knows? They want dirt on a politician they don't like, so they read their Twitter DMs.
So
they
it
saw
isn't
you in
just
a coffee shop and thought you were cute and asked the barista for your name. That's all they need. Some random intelligence creep can plug in your name, phone number, or email address and have access to years of your personal communications, web activity, address, personal details, All of it.
Well, in a lot of ways, you don't have to be some government official at the NSA to be able to pull up a lot of that stuff with how much we voluntarily just announce about ourselves.
No authoritarian regime in history has ever wielded that kind of surveillance power.
Technology is a big reason, though. If the Stalinist regime or something had technological access that we have now, you know, wouldn't it be the same? You're kind of limited to what you are using. But he's still right about the surveillance state that we're in based off of the availability of it.
Okay, dystopian prison population, largest surveillance apparatus in history, that all sounds pretty bad. But at least we have the freedom to criticize the government, right? The secret police aren't gonna come drag us away. Well, I've got some bad news for you there, too. US police are the most vicious and unaccountable in the world by far.
Interesting.
There are plenty of videos online of
Interesting. Do any of you have an argument against that? Saying that there are more lack of accountability police or more corrupt police? Man, that would take so much analysis to be able to, I think, confidently say what he is saying. And I'm not saying he's necessarily wrong, but to qualify it would be very difficult to do. But yeah, if you feel like you have an argument against that, post it in the comments.
arresting journalists, brutalizing peaceful protesters, even laughing about killing innocent people. I have a whole video on the subject, actually. But here's the gist of it. According to ongoing reporting, US police kill over 1,000 American citizens per year. 1,000 people. And I can hear the objection already. Yeah, well, some of those people were probably criminals. Police are not meant to be judge, jury, and executioner.
That is true.
They're meant to arrest people if they have to, and then hand them over to the judge, jury, and we really should talk about the executioner part. Open social media on any day of the week, and you'll see a story of an officer-involved shooting, where the media tries really hard to twist the reporting to make the cop sound less like a murderer.
Depending on your side, there's a lot of people that'll jump the gun. It's especially what you do. Because again, we're in a competition for our attention that people want to use the headlines that will put eyes on them. So what do? You put out something as quickly as possible.
With body cameras often required these days, it's getting harder for them to hide their crimes, though they still try. Anyway, the bottom line is this.
That's the difference. Everything's filmed now.
Any other country on Earth, let's say China, the hot-button supposed authoritarian hellhole of the day, and we compare police violence stats, the US is far worse.
Chinese surveillance is pretty nuts, though, when it comes to, all the closed circuit cameras that are around cities. And again, I'm not saying that doesn't exist in other places. There's plenty of closed circuit stuff inside, like in the United States, for example. But I've seen that where they have just like these, rooms of people that are just watching stuff. And a lot of it, I've heard, can be quite useful having that. For example, I forget what YouTube or something I was watching, but he was robbed or pickpocketed or something. Either robbed or pickpocketed. And it was a huge deal because I think his passport might have been in it. And he went and went to a policeman, right? He's in China. He's a foreigner. And they were like, okay. So they they went somewhere and found the public surveillance stuff and they were able to track it down. Like, it was incredible. But is that worth the negative effects that could come with it? That's where people might disagree, right?
In the US, in 2022, police killed 1,201 people. In China, that number is 0. Oh, wait, nope, I read that wrong. 0 people killed by police since 2019, a year when 2 people were killed. 2 people in 5 years. In a country with a
some people are like, they're
4
hiding
times
it.
greater than the United
They're
States.
hiding it.
Since 2019, US police have killed nearly 5,000 American citizens. So, we have a more dystopian prison situation, or the most spied on people.
So I know because this stuff is like self-reported, because there's no third-party source that can really get access to this kind of data. So like in the United States, again, a lot of this stuff is self-reported. Maybe it is more. What is the reporting system coming out of, say, China? Making sure we're consistent here.
Citizens.
I mean, I saw him pull up a Wikipedia article.
With a population 4 times greater.
Wonder where this data would then be tied to. Where would this come from? Where would you find this? So we can get a really accurate comparison.
Than the United States. Since 2019, US police have killed nearly 5,000 American citizens. So, we have a more dystopian prison situation, we're the most spied on people on Earth, and our police murder 3 people on average every single day. If that's not authoritarian, I don't know what is. And this isn't to run defense for the excesses of past and present socialist projects. In fact, socialists are among the loudest and most well-read critics of these experiments. The Deprogram guys and I have a podcast episode specifically dedicated to the topic, and we plan to do more in the future. The point of all...
Deprogram episode. I'm looking at there's at L's of socialism. Good to see them do that. One of the things we do in AP history classes, which is what I teach, there's a part of the writing process where you are going to bring up the counterclaim in whatever thing you've been assigned to argue, where you basically bring up the evidence that might say something else contrary to whatever your thesis is. But the goal for you, is to bring that up so you acknowledge it, showing that you have at least have attempted at least some kind of unbiased approach of this. But then, when it comes to arguing, because you're still arguing something, you then argue how your point is better than the counterpoints. And you want to do that without straw manning, which means you actually bring up very valid points.
This is that if we're going to rightly level criticism at some states, we need to make sure to apply that standard universally. And that means starting at home rather than simply passing judgment on countries halfway around the world or that have long since passed. Okay, that's the liberal part taken care of.
New set.
Now it's time to have a little chat with my friends on the Western left. The right does a very good job at presenting a unified front. The capitalist class and the forces of reaction are incredibly powerful in the imperial core.
Sure.
The left is already on the back foot, and we have been for many, many years. This is why it's frankly absurd how much infighting goes on among the left. Social democrats sniping at tankies for being authoritarian doesn't do the movement any good. Funnily enough,
there's a lot of
infighting. Authoritarian is only ever
especially because people will, for example, in at least the United States, group leftists and liberals together, which has huge differences. And there's infighting between them. So it definitely appears as a lot of infighting, when it really just means we're a lot more varied in our perspectives than maybe even we think, or at least what people will say.
Applied to successful socialist projects. The ones that failed were somehow more pure. But the moment a new system takes steps to ensure the security of their people and their new project, they're labeled authoritarian.
That is often what happens.
Part of this is that there's a lack of understanding among Western self-professed leftists.
And this happens in so many ways. Look at the French Revolution, right? The revolution is underway, and then when it's winning, I guess you would say, you look at like the Reign of Terror and the things that were put in by the victorious people of these revolutions and authoritarianism, or shoot, even to an extent like Napoleon, and trying to keep the ideals, or at least some ideals, of the French Revolution alive while also having regressive ones. So you're going to have that there. But then you saw it with, after these revolutions again. So it's like it's over. Look in the Soviet Union. So not just with the revolution, but also the Civil War, right? The communists are going to win out there. Then you have a regime that is trying to prevent itself from those people that sort of lost to basically, be able to make a revolution of their own. And the process by which you can do that, yes, can seem a very authoritarian. And again, it happens all over the place when there's something recent events that you believe are showing threats. You're going to do things and probably be more authoritarian in a way that you wouldn't have if those threats never existed. You know what I mean? Like there wouldn't have been a Patriot Act, if we wanted to bring up modern stuff in the United States, without the attacks of 9/11.
Regarding what it actually takes to change the status quo across an entire country. Every revolution, including
it's really hard, maybe impossible
like
to do that though.
One, are authoritarian by default. Those in power will never give up their power without a struggle. They're not going to let you vote out the very system that benefits them. To understand the nature of revolution a little better, let's go back to the man himself.
I don't want to say, is this not apologetics, but is it apologetics for the authoritarianism that did exist on the left after their revolutions in their countries? So basically saying it was necessary in that way. Okay, he's bringing up Marx. Let's see what we got.
Them. To understand the nature of revolution a little better, let's go back to the man himself. No, the other one. His sugar daddy. There we go. Friedrich Engels. This large beard wrote a brilliant little piece called On Authority. It's like a page long. None of you have any excuse not to read it. It's linked below.
One page.
But here's the part that I think is most applicable to this video. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeois?
Right.
Should we not, on the contrary,
I mean, it's probably right. When you're looking at that, especially context, if you want to use the French Revolution with that, there are a lot of forces that would love to see a return to the status quo in France, even including France's enemies from outside the world, or sorry, outside of France. Other countries that have historically been enemies of France would still like to see something like absolute rule, because it then justifies their type of monarchical rule, then side with the actual revolutionaries, because they don't want that to happen in their own state. So it's like every one of these revolutions does have some kind of period of authoritarianism to maintain the goals that they achieve by whatever means they did it, violently or not. He's basically saying all revolutions are violent. Also, even the term violence can have a lot of different meanings too when you look at its usage across history and definitions.
Reproach it for not having used it freely enough. Therefore, either one of two things. Either the anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case they are betraying the movement of the proletariat. In either case, they serve the reaction.
Sure. It also proves right there that there is really no such thing as everybody going to be sharing the same point of view naturally without some type of violence. There is that. Ridding an entire ideology or class, it's like almost not possible without violence, because maybe it's not possible for us to unify under any mindset without resorting to this.
While it might not feel good to be called out from beyond the grave, it's so important that we understand what Engels was talking about here, because it's still true today. If a mass of people decide they're done with the current oppressive system, rise up, build something new, and then fail to protect the gains they've made, their project will be destroyed.
Right.
We've seen it many times throughout history.
Sure.
The reactionary elements in society won't go away, and people with wealth and power before the revolution will still have that wealth.
Well, even going back to the French Revolution one more time, there's a lot of things that regressed as compared to what the rights were originally from, even just things like what was in the Declaration of Rights of Man or in their first constitutions. There was a lot of regression back to other things. So even with that and their authoritarianism, I guess you would say, there was still a reactionary movement that did have some success. I mean, literally, there was a return to monarchy in France.
And will have likely fled somewhere like the US where they can agitate for military or CIA intervention. This was the case in Chile in 1973, when the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende failed to take preventative measures to ensure the vicious reactionary class and their US-based co-conspirators couldn't undermine them.
The United States is a huge part of this.
Long story short, the Chilean right wing launched a US-backed and US-funded coup to overthrow the government, eliminate Allende, and install a fascist military dictatorship that plunged the country into recession and suffering for decades.
There's a lot of stories of that if you don't know with the United States. But it is a good example of how, and again, relating against the French Revolution about foreign parties that would like to insert themselves as counter-revolutionaries.
In order to avoid this happening, a budding socialist project, or heck, any project, requires police, it requires the shutting down of reactionary outlets, the banning of certain kinds of speech. There's a reason Germany banned everything related to the Nazis, for example. It's because they wanted to keep that sentiment from spreading as much as possible.
But it didn't. It just moved. It never went away. A lot of it was exported to other countries as well. Never did go away.
It requires an intelligence apparatus to listen for terrorists.
They were just defanged, I guess, in some ways, at least in Germany.
Plots, which were all too common.
Go back.
It requires an intelligence apparatus to listen for terrorist plots, which were all too common post-revolution. In East Germany, the reactionaries would routinely attempt to blow up civilian train lines. It requires prisons to keep these people off the streets. And historically speaking, the socialists have
Germans had no say, though, in their post-world rebuilding German citizens. So there was plenty of German citizens in the East or the West, I guess you would say, but in the East that did not necessarily want to be restructured in the way that they were imposed by the Soviet Union. You saw that. That's why many left to the left or went to the West side as well. But again, if you wanted to be on the other side and wanted to see that, you could move. But again, it's not that people had choices there.
Been much
on either
better
side.
At using prisons for rehabilitation rather than just packing human beings away to rot like we do in the US. These things may not be
Fair
morally
criticism.
correct, but like it or not, they are necessary. And that's something that every system has agreed on. I would love nothing more than to see an alternative work, but it never has. Maybe one day I'll be proven wrong. That would be amazing. But to the people who believe it is possible, you need to ask yourself how it's going to happen. We've seen what the people in Tsarist Russia had to do. We've seen what the Cubans had to do. We've seen what the Vietnamese had to do. What the Chinese had to do.
Every single one of them had to fight foreign intervention.
What the Americans had to do to separate from the British.
Needed French help.
Your anti-authoritarianism, while I genuinely believe it comes from a good place, is handing an easy victory to the capitalist regime. They want you to play by their rules. It's their game. You play by their rules, you lose. End of story.
Okay.
One final thing that's important to note is that this anti-authoritarian stance is very much a Western thing. And I think the reason for that is that we here in the Imperial Core are in a very privileged position.
Sure.
We can hold these naive beliefs because we don't have any skin in the game. We're not the ones under the boot.
True.
We're not the ones whose resources are being extracted, or
True.
whose homes are being bombed, or whose cities are being occupied by armed invaders in the name of freedom and democracy.
He's right.
We have the luxury of condemning others because we've never been on the receiving end. Think for just a moment what it would be like if
That
your
is,
neighborhood...
yeah, I mean, that's so important, but even the discussing of that, of the idea of privilege and people being born into privileged states is under attack right now. We actually have an education going on where you really can't, you're not supposed to use words like that because it's supposed to because it may bring in some kind of sense of guilt when it's just an accurate description of how your experiences are going to affect your outcome and how your life and what your circumstances are.
was occupied by a foreign military force, doing unspeakable things to your friends and loved ones, taking your belongings, burning homes, torturing people in the name of national security. What means would you resort to in that situation? I can't answer that for you, but it's something to think about. I know this has been kind of a heavy video, and for a lot of you, I'm sure this is the first time
Been
you've
way
been asked to
heavier.
look at your home country more critically.
I actually don't think it was very
If you're
heavy.
interested in learning more about any of the stuff we've talked about, there are links in the description. We all have a responsibility to choose our words carefully, apply labels correctly, and hold our own nations to the same standard we expect others to meet.
That's fair.
Maybe it's time we retire the word authoritarian and try to engage with the facts more precisely, more honestly, and in good faith.
I agree. All right, so what I could conclude from this is the thesis is kind of multi-part, but at first, kind of at the top of it was that that there is an irony about calling so many socialist states authoritarian, but not looking at it in the Western sort of democracies. Also, the fact that they're saying there's a double standard, that the way that these states are potentially authoritarian in socialist states does not match to what, like, say, the United States is, and you can argue that differently. But then also, though, he also kind of below that then said, well, okay, if they are authoritarian, and maybe we can logically conclude that they are, well, it was for a good reason. And saying that because they came out of revolutionary movements, and revolutionary movements are very prone to reactionary movements, meaning that the goals of those revolutions, which may be newly met, could then be taken away. So it was kind of two-part. I don't want to say he was necessarily like hypocritical about it, because it was like, in one sense, saying that they're actually like not very authoritarian, but then also saying, well, they needed to be authoritarian. Like if they were, then they needed to. So be it. But there were definitely points within that I think were valid. You also heard that I agreed with a lot of the things that he had out there about the prison systems, police systems, and the way that, again, we use these words without actually holding up a mirror to ourselves. And I think those are very valid points that should be taken away from this. So, well, anyway, I asked a bunch of questions along the way, so I'd love to see your comments down below. Thank you for being kind to each other in there. And with that, thank you again for your support. No doubt this video will likely get demonetized because it brings up a lot of things that are never really deemed as friendly towards, what YouTube believes are ad friendliness. So love your support that way. Give the video a like, sub to the channel if you have not. And with that, thank you all. We'll see you next time.